The dust of the high desert clung to her like a shroud, caking the worn leather of her duster and the brim of a hat pulled low, shadowing eyes that had seen too much winter for a soul so young. She rode not with the easy lope of a seasoned drover, but with a rigid purpose, her spine straight against the cantle, her gaze fixed on the hazy outline of Redemption Gulch simmering in the midday heat. 10 years. 10 years since this town, or the men who ruled it, had cast her out, a piece of refuse to be bartered and broken. The horse, a lean, scarred mustang as resilient as its rider, plodded onward, its hooves kicking up small puffs of ochre that were quickly swallowed by the arid wind. Redemption Gulch. The name was a bitter irony that tasted like ash in her mouth. There was no redemption here, not yet. Only a festering wound, and she had returned to lance it. As the first weathered buildings of the town proper came into view, the slat-sided general store, the livery with its sagging roof, the audacious two-story facade of the Golden Garter saloon, a hush seemed to fall. Men lounging on the boardwalk, their talk momentarily silenced, turned as one to watch her approach. Their eyes, hard and incurious at first, flickered with something else as she drew nearer. Not recognition, not yet, but an unease, a primal instinct that registered the arrival of something significant, perhaps dangerous. She was a woman, alone, yet she carried herself with an aura that belied vulnerability. Her hands, resting on the pommel, were gloved, but the set of her jaw, the unwavering steel in her eyes as they swept over the familiar, hateful landmarks, spoke of a hardness forged in fires they could not imagine. Her gaze lingered on the wide, dusty expanse before the saloon, an open space often used for public announcements, or, once, for auctions of a different, more terrible kind. A tremor, so faint it was almost imperceptible, ran through her. Sheriff Ben Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of compromise and regret, watched her from the shaded doorway of his office. He'd seen his share of drifters, of hard cases, but this one was different. There was a stillness about her, a cold intensity that prickled the hairs on the back of his neck. He shifted his weight, the gun belt creaking, a familiar comfort that felt suddenly inadequate. She dismounted in front of the livery, her movements economical, devoid of flourish. No name was offered to the wary ostler, just a silver coin for the horse's care. Then, she turned, her gaze sweeping the faces that watched her, lingering on no one, yet seeing everyone. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and in their depths, a promise of reckoning. Thorne pushed himself off the door frame. He was the law here, such as it was. He had to know. He ambled towards her, his thumbs hooked in his belt. He began, his voice a low rumble. "Welcome to Redemption Gulch. Just passing her through." Her head tilted slightly, the brim of her hat casting her face further into shadow. Only her mouth was clearly visible, a firm, unsmiling line. "Not just passing through, Sheriff." Her voice was low, unexpectedly raspy, like stones grinding together. "I've come home." The words, simple as they were, sent a chill through Thorne, a chill that had nothing to do with the relentless sun. Home. Who would call this sun-blasted purgatory home, especially with such a tone? He saw not a hint of warmth in her eyes, only the flat, cold glint of something long buried, now unearthed. The ostler, who had been trying to appear busy, froze mid-stride, his eyes wide. A whisper started at the edge of the small crowd, a rustle of disquiet that spread like tumbleweed in a gale. This was no ordinary arrival. This was an omen. Elara, for that was the name she carried like a shield, secured a room at the widow McGregor's boarding house, a slightly less dilapidated structure at the quieter end of town. Martha McGregor, a woman whose eyes held a permanent sorrow but also a flicker of shrewd kindness, assessed her new boarder with a keen gaze. She saw the weariness that went bone deep, the calluses on hands that had known hard labor, not genteel pursuits. She saw the ghost of a younger face beneath the sun-weathered skin, a face she vaguely recalled, tied to a memory that brought a familiar ache to her heart. "Just Elara?" Martha had asked, her voice gentle. "Just Elara," came the clipped reply. No questions were asked about her past, no pleasantries exchanged beyond the necessary. Elara paid for a week in advance with coins that were old and worn, as if they too had traveled a long and bitter road. Her room was small, sparse, overlooking the main street. From her window, she could see the comings and goings, the pulse of the town that had once been her cage. She watched, silent and unmoving, for hours, her presence a weight on the very air of Redemption Gulch. She noted the men who swaggered with an unearned authority, their holsters tied low, their eyes predatory. These were Jedediah Blackwood's men. Blackwood! The name was a brand on her soul. He owned most of the town, the ranches surrounding it, the saloon, even the souls of many of its inhabitants. He was a man whose greed was a bottomless pit, a man who saw people as chattel, as tools, as firewood to be bought, used, and discarded. News of the stranger reached Blackwood quickly. He sat in his opulent office above the Golden Garter, a fat spider in the center of his web, surrounded by ledgers and sycophants. He was older now, his bulk spilling over the sides of his custom-made chair, his face florid, but his eyes still held the same cruel, calculating glint. "A woman, you say," he scoffed to his foreman, a rat-faced man named Cletus. "Alone? Probably some dirt farmer's runaway wife looking for trouble. Keep an eye on her. If she steps out of line, remind her who owns this town." Cletus nodded, eager to please, but even he had felt the strange tension Elara's arrival had cast over the gulch. "There's something about her, boss." "Something?" Cold. Blackwood waved a dismissive, beringed hand. "Cold? I'll show her cold if she crosses me." But later, alone with his brandy, a sliver of unease pricked him. A woman, alone, with eyes like frozen chips of sky. It stirred a vague, unpleasant memory, one he had long since buried under layers of profit and power. Elara, meanwhile, moved through her days with quiet deliberation. She ate her meals in silence at the boarding house, her gaze often distant, lost in a landscape only she could see. Sometimes, a flicker of raw pain would cross her features, a tightening around her mouth, a distant echo in her eyes. It was in those moments that Martha McGregor would feel a profound, inexplicable urge to reach out, to offer some comfort, but the wall around Elara was formidable, built of stone and ice. Sheriff Thorne, too, found himself increasingly troubled. Elara, the name echoed in the dusty archives of his memory. He'd been younger then, less jaded, perhaps even more cowardly. He remembered a girl, barely a woman, with eyes that pleaded, sold on the steps of the general store to settle a dead father's gambling debts. Sold to a cruel taskmaster from the territories, a transaction overseen and profited from by Jedediah Blackwood. He remembered the silence of the townsfolk, their averted gazes. His own shame burned fresh. Could it be her? After all this time? The thought was a stone in his gut. The next morning, Elara walked with slow, measured steps towards the center of town. She bypassed the saloon, the mercantile, her destination clear. She stopped before the wide, weathered steps of the general store, the very spot where the auctioneer's gavel had fallen like a death knell on her girlhood. The wood was bleached by the sun, scarred by countless boots, but to her, it was a platform of profound degradation. From a fold in her duster, she produced a single, wild desert bloom, a hardy primrose, its petals a defiant splash of yellow against the drab surroundings. With infinite care, she knelt and placed the flower on the topmost step, a silent, poignant memorial. Martha McGregor, on her way to purchase supplies, witnessed the act from across the street. Her breath caught in her throat. The flower, the place, the woman's solemn stillness, it was a key unlocking a dark chamber in her memory. She hurried across the dusty thoroughfare, her usual caution forgotten. "Child," she whispered, her voice trembling, as she reached Elara, who was now rising, her face unreadable. "It's you, isn't it?" "Elara." "The Miller girl." The one they sold. Elara turned, her stormy eyes meeting Martha's, and for the first time, a flicker of something raw, something vulnerable, showed through the ice. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "They sold me like firewood, Mrs. McGregor." Elara's voice was flat, devoid of self-pity, yet heavy with the weight of that truth. "To pay a debt my father never truly owed." Blackwood saw an opportunity. "He always does." Martha's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling. "Oh, dear Lord. We all knew. We all stood by." The admission was a painful whisper. "I was just a girl," Elara stated, not as an accusation, but as a fact. And Blackwood, he enjoyed it. He enjoyed the power. She spoke of the brutal years that followed, the harsh labor, the cruelty, the crushing loneliness. She didn't dwell on the worst of it, her eyes told that story more eloquently than words. She spoke of escape, of learning to survive in a world that had tried to break her, of the burning, unyielding resolve that had finally brought her back. Not for revenge, she said, though the word hung unspoken in the air. For justice. For the memory of the girl she had been. Word of Ilara's identity, of her purpose, spread through Redemption Gulch with the speed of a prairie fire. The whispers turned into hushed, fearful conversations. Guilt, long dormant, gnawed at some. Fear, fresh and potent, gripped others. Blackwood was not a man to be crossed. His reaction would be swift and brutal. And indeed, Jedediah Blackwood was more than alarmed now, he was furious. The Miller girl. He remembered her. A scrawny thing, all eyes and fear. He'd thought her long dead, or broken beyond remembering. That she had returned, a woman now, with that chilling composure, was an affront, a direct challenge to his authority. Find her, he snarled at Cletus and a half-dozen of his other hard-bitten enforcers. Bring her to the Golden Garter. We'll have a little chat. Remind her what happens to ungrateful property that tries to get above its station. His men found Ilara walking back towards the boarding house. They fanned out, attempting to surround her, their expressions a mixture of bravado and unease. Mr. Blackwood wants a word, Cletus said, his hand hovering near his pistol. Ilara stopped. She looked at each man, her gaze lingering, cold and assessing. I have nothing to say to Jedediah Blackwood that I won't say to the whole town when the time is right, she replied, her voice calm, yet carrying a resonance that made them hesitate. Now, if you'll excuse me, she made to move past them. One of the men, bolder or stupider than the rest, reached out to grab her arm. Before his fingers could make contact, Ilara moved with a speed that was startling. Her hand, which had been resting near the opening of her duster, flashed out. Not with a gun, but with a short, weighted leather quirt that appeared as if by magic. It cracked across the man's reaching hand with a sound like a pistol shot. He howled, clutching his injured fingers, his face contorted in pain and surprise. The other men flinched back, their bravado evaporating. Ilara's eyes were chips of deadly ice. Tell Blackwood, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout, that I am not property. And I am done being grateful for scraps of decency he never offered. I will speak with him. But it will be on my terms. She then walked past them, unhurried, leaving them stunned and, for the first time, truly afraid of the woman they had been sent to intimidate. The balance of power in Redemption Gulch had just subtly, irrevocably, shifted. The air in Redemption Gulch grew thick with anticipation, heavy as a thunderhead. Blackwood, incensed by his men's failure and Ilara's defiance, knew he couldn't let this challenge stand. His power was built on fear, on the absolute certainty of his dominance. To allow this woman, this ghost from his past, to dictate terms was unthinkable. He would make an example of her, crush her publicly, and remind everyone in this godforsaken town who held the reins. He sent word, not a request, but a summons, for Ilara to meet him in the street, in front of the Golden Garter, at high noon the next day. He wanted an audience. He wanted the town to witness her humiliation. Ilara accepted, her calm unwavering. Martha McGregor pleaded with her. He'll destroy you, child. He has too many men, too much power. Ilara simply looked at the older woman, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. He already tried to destroy me once, Martha. He failed. Sheriff Thorne, caught between his conscience and his ingrained fear of Blackwood, paced his office like a caged animal. He knew what Blackwood intended. He also knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that Ilara was not some helpless victim to be cowed. This was a powder keg, and the fuse was lit. High noon arrived with a brutal, exposing sun. The street before the Golden Garter was unnervingly empty, then gradually, townsfolk began to gather at the periphery, their faces etched with anxiety and a morbid curiosity. They kept their distance, huddling in doorways and beneath awnings, a silent, fearful chorus. Jedediah Blackwood emerged onto the balcony of the saloon, flanked by Cletus and a dozen of his most ruthless hands. He surveyed the scene, a sneer on his lips. Then, Ilara appeared. She walked from the direction of the boarding house, alone, her duster unbuttoned, revealing plain, sturdy clothing beneath. She carried no visible weapon, yet her very presence was a challenge. She stopped in the center of the dusty street, facing the saloon, her head held high. Blackwood descended the stairs, his bulk making each step groan. He strode towards her, his men fanning out behind him. "Well, well," he boomed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Look what the cat dragged in. The little miller whelp, all grown up. Come back to beg for scraps, have you? Or perhaps you missed the taste of my generosity." He chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. Ilara did not flinch. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, cutting through the heavy silence. "I've come back for what you stole, Blackwood. Not money. Not land. You stole a life. You stole a childhood. You sold a human being as if she were no more than a side of beef she was debt." Blackwood roared, his face purpling. "Her father's debt. I merely collected what was owed. You inflated that debt. You preyed on a grieving family. You orchestrated that sale for your own profit and your own vile amusement." Ilara's words were like hammer blows, each one landing with precision. "You took a child, Blackwood, and you cast her into hell. And this town," her gaze swept the watching crowd, "this town watched and did nothing." A murmur went through the onlookers. Shame and anger warred on their faces. Blackwood sensed the shift. "She's a liar. A troublemaker," he bellowed. "She's here to bleed you dry, just like her worthless father tried to do. Seize her." He gestured to his men. Cletus and two others lunged forward. What happened next was a blur of motion. Ilara didn't draw a gun. Instead, from beneath her duster, her right hand emerged, not with a quirt this time, but with a length of braided leather that uncoiled with lightning speed, a stockwhip. The air cracked like a rifle shot as the tip of the whip danced, a living thing in her hand. It wrapped around Cletus's gun hand before he could even clear leather, yanking the pistol from his grasp. Another crack, and the second man stumbled back, a searing line appearing on his cheek. The third froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ilara stood, the whip now coiled loosely in her hand, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "I learned many things in the years you cast me away, Blackwood," she said, her voice dangerously soft. "I learned how to work like a man, how to endure like an animal, and how to fight like a demon when cornered." Blackwood, momentarily stunned, recovered his bluster. "Kill her," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Shoot her down." His remaining men hesitated, unnerved by her skill and the feral intensity in her eyes. It was in that moment of hesitation that Sheriff Thorne finally moved. He stepped out from the side of his office, his shotgun held loosely but purposefully. "That's enough, Blackwood." Thorne's voice was surprisingly firm. "This ain't a lynching. This is redemption, Gulch, not your personal slaughterhouse." Blackwood whirled on him. "Thorne! You dare side with this trash against me?" "I'm siding with the law, Jedediah," Thorne replied, his gaze steady. "Something you seem to have forgotten exists." A tense standoff ensued. Blackwood's men, Ilara, and Thorne. The cowardly crowd, however, was no longer entirely cowardly. An old farmer stepped forward, then another. A blacksmith, his hammer still in his hand, moved to stand near Thorne. The tide was turning. The fragile truce shattered as one of Blackwood's more desperate gunmen, ignoring Thorne, raised his pistol towards Ilara. The crack of the stockwhip and the boom of Thorne's shotgun seemed to erupt simultaneously. The gunman cried out, his weapon clattering to the dust as the whip bit into his arm, while Thorne's buckshot tore into the wooden post above another thug's head, sending splinters flying and a clear message. The street erupted into a maelstrom of sudden, brutal violence. Ilara moved with a dancer's deadly grace, her whip a whirlwind, disarming, tripping, driving men back. She wasn't fighting for bloodlust, but with a focused, desperate intensity, the culmination of 10 years of pain and resilience. She fought for the terrified girl who had stood on those auction steps, for the dignity that had been stripped away and painstakingly reclaimed. Thorn, for his part, laid down covering fire, his shotgun a formidable deterrent, forcing Blackwood's men to seek cover rather than advance. He was old, and his heart pounded like a runaway train, but a sense of rightness, long suppressed, flowed through him. He was finally doing his job, not as Blackwood's enabler, but as a true lawman. The townsfolk, emboldened by Ilara's courage and Thorn's stand, began to act. Some threw rocks, others wielded farm implements, their fear finally overcome by a collective sense of outrage. They were no longer passive spectators to injustice, they were participants in its undoing. Blackwood, seeing his enforcers falter and the town turn against him, felt a cold dread seep into his bones. His empire of fear was crumbling before his very eyes. His face, moments before contorted with rage, now showed the unmistakable pallor of cowardice. He began to back away, looking for an escape, his eyes darting like a cornered rat. Ilara saw his retreat. Leaving the remaining thugs to Thorn and the now emboldened citizens, she moved towards Blackwood, her eyes fixed on him, the whip trailing behind her like a serpent. "You're not going anywhere, Blackwood," she said, her voice low and resonant. He stumbled, trying to turn and flee into the saloon, but she was too quick. The whip lashed out, not to injure, but to ensnare, its leather thongs wrapping around his ankles, sending him crashing to the dusty ground with an undignified thump. His fine suit was instantly covered in dirt, his hat rolling away. He lay there, winded and humiliated, the great tyrant of Redemption Gulch brought low by the woman he had discarded like refuse. Ilara stood over him, not with triumph, but with a profound, weary sadness. "It's over." Blackwood. Sheriff Thorn, his shotgun still smoking, moved to Blackwood's side and roughly pulled him to his feet, snapping manacles onto his wrists. "Jedediah Blackwood," Thorn said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "you're under arrest. For assault, for incitement to riot, and for a list of other crimes that I reckon will take a long time to tally." The fight was over. Blackwood's remaining men, seeing their leader captured and the townsfolk united, either surrendered or melted away into the alleyways. Silence descended, broken only by the ragged breathing of the combatants and the low murmurs of the crowd. Ilara slowly coiled her whip, her shoulders slumping slightly as the adrenaline receded. She looked at the townsfolk, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and newfound respect. Martha McGregor pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears and dust, and enfolded Ilara in a fierce hug. "You did it, child," she whispered. "You truly did it." Ilara didn't seek personal vengeance beyond ensuring Blackwood faced the justice system. In the days that followed, she worked with Thorn, providing testimony, pointing towards evidence of Blackwood's long reign of corruption and exploitation. Other townsfolk, finding their courage, came forward with their own stories of his abuses. The foundation of his power, built on intimidation and ill-gotten gains, began to crumble. She sought no reward, no land, no position. Her mission had been to see justice initiated, to reclaim her own stolen dignity, and to awaken the conscience of a town that had slept too long. When the circuit judge finally arrived and Blackwood was formally indicted, his assets frozen pending investigation, Ilara knew her time in Redemption Gulch was drawing to a close. She departed as quietly as she had arrived, her scarred Mustang carrying her away from the town, now different, forever changed by her return. She paused on the rise overlooking the gulch, the same spot from which she had first seen it on her return. It looked smaller now, less menacing. Sheriff Thorn rode out to meet her. He offered his hand. "The town owes you, Ilara." She took it, her grip firm. "It owes itself, Sheriff. To remember. To do better." He nodded, understanding. "Will you be back?" "The past is buried here, Sheriff," she said, her gaze sweeping over the town. "Properly, this time. My path leads elsewhere." With a final nod, she turned her horse and rode towards the horizon, a lone figure dissolving into the vast, indifferent landscape. She had come like a storm, seeking not to destroy, but to cleanse. She left behind a town bruised but awakened, a town that might, finally, live up to its name. They had sold a child, treating her like firewood, and thought the dust of seasons would cover their sin, that time would erase the memory of their complicity. But what happens when the past refuses to remain a ghost, when courage, forged in the crucible of suffering, returns not as a whisper, but as a righteous thunder, demanding a reckoning that can no longer be denied? If you were Elara, faced with those who wronged you, what would you have sought? Vengeance, justice, or something else entirely? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story of resilience and redemption struck a chord, make sure to click on our next video and subscribe for more tales that challenge the heart and stir the soul.